Welcome to Inside the Teen Mind. I'm Amanda McMillan, a licensed clinical social worker and executive director of the Alive Center.
And I'm Dr. Lisa Connick, clinical psychologist and owner of Connick & Associates.
As we introduce this podcast, we will peel back the layers of adolescent development to help parents, caregivers, and professionals better understand what's really happening beneath the surface. For the next 3 episodes, we're diving into a special mini-series on adolescent development. We'll walk you through the 3 major stages: early adolescence, middle adolescence, and late adolescence, and explore the emotional, social, and cognitive shifts that shape each one.
Whether you're raising a preteen, supporting a high schooler, or launching a young adult into the world, each stage brings its own challenges and moments of growth. By the end of this mini-series, you'll have a clearer picture of what's typical, what's not, and how to support your teen at every stage. You can listen to each segment individually or all together for a complete understanding of how teens grow emotionally and socially from ages 10 through 24. Let's jump in. This segment focuses on early adolescence, typically the ages of 10 to 14. Even if you're joining us just for this portion, you'll get a clear picture of what's happening during this important transition from childhood to the early teen years. This is the stage where we see rapid physical, cognitive, and emotional changes that begin to take center stage. And parents often describe it as the moment when their once predictable child starts to feel like a stranger in their own home.
Lisa, when you think of early adolescence, what's the biggest misconception you hear from parents in your practice?
I think that's a very good question, Amanda. And I think some of the major misconceptions that parents tend to have about adolescence, and there are several that we can talk about today, is that teenagers are simply being difficult, defiant, or self-centered, and that they're doing this on purpose.
I can definitely relate to that.
Yes.
For sure. I have 4 teenagers of my own.
So I think as parents, Amanda and I are both parents and of teenagers and or young adults, and we can relate to a lot of these factors as well. So I think about in this stage, adolescence is really a period of really profound neurological, emotional, and social development, and second only to early childhood in terms of brain change. So a lot of times we think about teens aren't just rebelling. They're really learning how to think independently. They're forming their own identities, and they're managing increasingly complex emotions, all while their brains, we'll call it the emotional accelerator, is developing a lot faster than the brake system for impulse control.
You know, I was talking to a colleague earlier today, and she was saying that when you're talking to middle schoolers, like that 11 to 14 age range, that a lot of times you have to think about instant gratification when you're really trying to relate to them. If you're talking about longer term consequences of their behavior, it just doesn't really register, right? You know, like, oh, if you don't pay attention to your homework and you're not, staying on top of it, it might be hard to get into college later. They're like, what are you talking about? But if you say something like, hey, if you don't get good grades now, you're not going to be able to go to your football practice or your band practice. That's like an immediate thing that they want to do, and that relates more to them thinking about that instant gratification. And that sounds kind of like what you're talking about.
Absolutely. And I think that's where parents sometimes do have unrealistic, if you will, expectations that their kids are thinking the way they are about long-term payoff for short-term pain. Like homework is a pain point for a lot of us. Kids don't want to do it. We didn't want to do it either, really.
Yeah.
But that's a tricky thing for teenagers to really conceptualize too far into the future.
Yeah, so really thinking about those immediate consequences. What else are other pain points?
Some of the other things that I think, as we're talking about homework, let's talk about that misconception that teens are lazy.
Oh, right.
So the perspective of teens are lazy or unmotivated. What can look a lot like apathy from a parent perspective is often exhaustion, anxiety, or perfectionism under the surface. So the teen years are very demanding if we think about what's going on and what our expectations are for adolescence. And they're demanding academically, socially, and emotionally on teenagers. And so many teens do feel a lot of pressure to meet adult expectations while they're still developing the skills to manage and prioritize stress.
It kind of sounds like that fight or flight thing, right? So I think about like a deer in headlights. If you're feeling overwhelmed and you don't know what to do, you just kind of freeze, or maybe just like it's just easier to sleep it off, or just go be on the computer and play video games for hours and hours instead of like facing the stress that's ahead of them. Is that kind of like what you're talking about?
Absolutely. And I think if we think about what the teens' coping strategies are, it may be very limited comparatively to adults. So sleep or decompressing with video games, social interactions, playing on their phones, those are their stress reducers.
Right.
So when we see our teens doing that, they might be avoiding something unpleasant, but they also may be feeling limited and needing that decompression time.
Yeah. And I know we're going to have a whole nother episode just talking about social media and phones, because phones are kind of like a double-edged sword, right? It's a great way to decompress if you're like playing games or whatever, but sometimes it can also be an extra stressor if there's things going on, because they can't disconnect from their social groups, right? And then that can add extra stress to their lives above and beyond all the academic stuff.
Absolutely. And as you say, connect, that is one of the other misconceptions I think that parents have with their adolescents, which is parents often assume that their teens don't want to connect, that they'd rather be with friends or on their phone rather than with family. And the truth is that most teens actually do crave closeness and guidance from their parents. However, they need it in a way that respects their growing autonomy. So when parents, a lot of times if we can think about our anxieties as parents are task-oriented, getting your homework done. Did you apply for that scholarship? Did you pack for, your lunch and get ready for your football practice? So we're focusing on tasks. That's not the way our teens are looking to connect to us. So they're probably going to get frustrated, avoidant, and maybe isolate a bit. But really, when parents respond with curiosity instead of control, and in validation, not invalidation, instead of judgment, teens are much more likely to open up.
Yeah. It's kind of like going from like that coach, right? Where you're telling them, this is what you have to do, this is what you have to do, okay, did you do this, what do, kind of get to that end goal, because your goal is to get them to school or get them to practice, and we're in task mode. I know that when I'm with my kids, I have a million things I'm going through my checklist in my brain to think about everything I need to do to get to A, B, or C. But for them, they want more autonomy, right? They want to be treated more with respect, and so instead of saying, set your alarm for 6 a.m., maybe instead say, okay, we need to be at school at 7:15. What time do you want to wake up in the morning? And do you need help with that type of thing? Like kind of asking them and give them a little more choice around and involved in that makes them feel more respected.
Absolutely. I think, and they're playing with this, right? So they're going to we'll talk in another section on allowing our kids to fail and what that means. But I think also showing genuine interest in the things that they're interested in. Whether that be their video games, their, silly TikTok videos that we think are silly, but they think are funny and humorous and interesting, finding that connection through shared interests.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thanks so much for that, Lisa. That's really insightful. I really appreciate that.
And so I think in short, adolescence is not really about rebellion. If we think about it, it's transformational. It's a transformational period. And if we can understand their teen behavior, or when parents can understand their teens' behavior, that it's driven by growth and not defiance, it might be a lot easier to respond with empathy, patience, and more perspective.
Yeah, words are really powerful. How you frame things in your mind really sets the tone for how you're going to engage. If you're assuming that your kid is just being defiant and just doesn't want to listen to you, versus that they're changing and they're transforming into a more independent being, and you have to adapt your parenting style or your way that you engage with these youth, that will help you be less frustrated.
Absolutely. I like the term, I'm so excited to see what you will become.
Yeah, that's a good one. I like that.
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. Well, let's start talking about early adolescence. So this is the ages 10 to 13, right? Can you tell us a little bit about what should we expect from that age range?
Absolutely. So I'm thinking about sectioning this off, Amanda. We'll talk about brain development first. During early adolescence, the brain is undergoing one of its dramatic periods of change, as I mentioned a moment ago, and it's a tremendous growth, reorganization, and rewiring. So one of the things that we think about in terms of terminology here is what's going on in the amygdala, which is the brain's emotional center.
Ooh.
This part of the brain develops pretty rapidly during early adolescence, which means that emotions are starting to feel a lot stronger. They're more intense and they can look unpredictable. So this is where you're seeing your moody teen. Teens at this age can go from joy to frustration in moments or seconds, not because they're moody on purpose, but because their emotional systems are maturing a lot faster than the parts of the brain that are regulating. So we think about the difference between the executive functioning system, which is the control system, and the emotional system. They're not maturing at the same rate.
Yeah. I can definitely relate to that. I've definitely gone into a room where my daughter, and I'm like, why are you crying? She's like, I don't know. Like, I'm so sorry. What can I do for you? Right.
And then she gets mad at you for asking.
Exactly. And it's kind of, one of those days where you're mommy and then you're like, leave me alone. I don't want you. Right. So it's kind of like, it's hard to manage those mood swings. It kind of reminds me of like the toddler stages almost, when they were very little, they would just kind of, if they didn't get their way or something, they would just have a breakdown. And it's very similar in those early adolescents, right?
Absolutely. That's the distress tolerance piece, which goes into that regulatory system that we can refer to as the prefrontal cortex, which is the frontal piece of the brain, or the area of the brain that is responsible for planning, emotional control, and decision making, and also understanding long-term consequences. Amanda, you talked about that a little bit ago, about that immediacy effect. So this part of the brain is still immature, and it's developing at a slower rate compared to the emotion center of the brain. So we've got this very powerful emotional engine in the amygdala, for example, and that's revving up while the brakes of the prefrontal cortex are still being built. So this is a recipe pretty much for strong feelings, quick reactions, and learning through trial and error.
It seems like almost like the construction phase of adolescent development, right? Where it's kind of building that foundation of your brain's development. It's really switching from a child into that adolescent stage, and there's real science behind why teens respond the way they do.
Absolutely. The other piece that I think we need to talk about is the reward system of the brain. It's very sensitive at this stage. So early adolescents tend to be really wired to seek out excitement, novelty, and social approval. It's how their brains encourage them to explore, to take risks, and to learn about the world. That's why things like new experiences, friendships, and even small social wins feel really powerful. So you might see that shift with a lot of sensitivity about peer approval, social approval, likes on social media. This is really triggering that reward system of your adolescent's brain.
Yeah. And if they're really nervous about it, I'm sure that can almost be kind of going back to that fight or flight kind of thing. Fight, flight, or freeze. I forgot the freeze part,
absolutely.
right? Yes. And that was, should have added that in with the reference earlier. But with that freeze part, then, they might feel immobilized, right? And worried about going into a new social setting and really nervous about it. And as a parent, it might be you might want to protect them. You're like, it's okay. You don't have to go to that dance. You don't have to go to that, game and sit in the stands with your friends if you're nervous about it. But really, I think that this is where they have to try.
Yes.
And then realize that they can get through it and build that resilience and help them become more confident in their skills as an individual to be able to make friends with new people and be able to adapt in certain situations.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think put simply here, early adolescence we're looking at this as a time when emotional parts of the brain are in overdrive. The logical parts are still under construction. The drive for new experiences is at an all-time high, which is where we see some risky behaviors can kind of start setting stages. And then it's a perfect storm for growth and the occasional meltdown.
Yeah.
And then this is all very normal. This is normal brain development. So, the easier it is for parents to respond with patience, empathy, perspective, instead of frustration or worry, I think the better both parent-child relationships will be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. So let's move on to some of the other components of early adolescence, that construction phase, like the physical changes. Every parent knows that time when you have to have that awkward conversation with your teenager about buying deodorant.
Yes.
And I'll never forget, when my kids were between 11 and 13, I felt like every 3 months I was buying them a new shoe size.
Oh, yes. Yes. Growth spurts.
Yes.
Growth spurts.
Right. And it's a real thing, too. They literally grow, I think, between the 6th grade and 8th grade year, my boys grew at least 6 to 8 inches each in their sizes, their foot, their height. They went from little chunky, cute little kids to really lean, tall teenagers. And then for girls, too, they're starting to bud, they're getting their periods, and all of this, it really is something that they become very self-conscious about.
Absolutely.
They don't want to talk about it. They just want to hide it, is what at least my experience is.
Yes, and I think it is definitely a time of increased self-consciousness, and body image issues can start to play into the picture here.
Absolutely.
So we really want to be aware of how to support our kiddos when they are developing into some of the kiddos will approach this with a lot of enthusiasm. And I remember when my kids started getting facial hair, this was a big deal to have a little baby mustache. And others are very uncomfortable and want to hide those physical changes.
Absolutely. And for me as a parent, I tend to let them kind of guide, especially this is where they start buying their own clothes. I can't buy any clothes for them anymore because it doesn't matter if it's something they would have chosen. If I chose it, they don't want to wear it, right? So negotiating those kinds of things and helping them kind of come into their own style and what they feel comfortable wearing. And also, just as parents, we need to kind of pay attention, too, about how they're starting to identify with themselves in regards to positive self-image, or if they're becoming really insecure in themselves.
And some of the things we think about from a developmental perspective is the impact of early or late puberty. And it's the difference across genders. So girls that tend to develop early, such as in late elementary school, for example, tend to have a lot more self-consciousness. Boys who develop early have a lot more confidence because they're bigger than their peers, and they may be better athletically and maybe getting that attention that they get esteem from, whereas early developing females tend to get a lot of self-consciousness with the attention. Likewise, late developing adolescents for boys particularly can be much more insecure because they're smaller than their typical peer group. So keep these things in mind when your child is developing physical characteristics of in adolescence, that there could be different stages of how they're experiencing those bodily changes.
Yeah. And this really transitions into kind of like those emotional and social changes that happen as well, because what I notice in this stage is that most adolescents just want to fit in. They don't want to stand out in any way, which their physical changes make that nearly impossible.
Yes, right? Absolutely. They're going to stick out a little bit more depending. Yeah. And I think about the difference between a 6th grader and an 8th grader. Mm-hmm. They look like they come from 2 different worlds sometimes, right? You've got a little person and a giant. So this can be very intimidating for your adolescence as well. But in thinking of identity is starting to emerge at this stage. And where do I fit in is a really important question. Your teens are likely to start comparing themselves to others more, not just how they look, but how they think, what they're good at, and what makes them unique. So parents may actually start noticing their preteen experimenting with new styles of clothing. Like we said, they may shift their clothes every few weeks. Also their interests or their friend groups. And this is when we see a lot of social differences, as well as kids that were friends in elementary school might be trying out some new peer groups. And that can be healthy or unhealthy for them to navigate some of those differences, and what does that feel like until they find what's really authentic for them. There's a lot of copycatting effect first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're really trying to find their space, their group, right? And it can be really confusing, especially if you're friends with Betty one day and the next day Betty is off with another group of friends and doesn't talk to you anymore. That can be really confusing and hurtful.
Yes. Very hurtful. Mm-hmm. And I think there's also some classic push-pull in this stage. What we see is that need for high autonomy, like I want to do these things on my own, yet still very dependent on parents. Parents sometimes we'll call this the bipolar stage of adolescence because there's a lot of push-pull here, and their moods are very up and down when it comes to, I need you, I hate you. Mm-hmm. Right. The teens are going to want more freedom at this stage. They want to make choices and test boundaries, but they are still really deeply in need of parental guidance for safety, structure, and emotional grounding.
And don't forget the car. I mean, how are these teens going to get anywhere if it isn't for the mom taxi? You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
And honestly, I find that I learn more about my kids now when I am the taxi. I kind of like it because when they're in the back seat with their friends, I find out all of a sudden about all the hot goss that's going on at school or at the different grades. You know, they won't, if I'm like, hey, tell me, how was school today? It's fine. It was good. You know, but then when they're talking to their friends, I'm just like, oh, wow. So that's what's going on. Okay.
That's the fun part, too. And, the other piece that I think we see is when you're sitting side by side with your kiddo, it's definitely different than sitting face to face.
Yeah.
I tend to get more news side by side.
Yeah.
It's a lot less intimidating.
Absolutely. Well, at the Alive Center, we focus on kind of like that play therapy with teens. And that's how we get them to open up, is instead of just sit down and tell me all about your life, we sit down and we color next to each other, or we'll play Uno No Mercy. And as things come out, then the kids naturally start talking about their day or about something that happened. And it just is so much more natural than trying to just like force them to talk.
Yeah.
We let them really guide it.
So I guess what we can end with is in this phase, a lot of these emotional shifts are very normal and healthy. The early adolescence stage is really, if we think about it, rehearsal for adulthood. They're practicing, and parents do play a very crucial role in providing both the runway for independence and the safety net for when things get bumpy.
Excellently said. Well, that wraps up our look at early adolescence, a stage full of firsts, rapid growth, and early identity exploration. If you'd like to continue learning about the next phase of development, check out our segment on middle adolescence, where we dig into identity, peer influence, and the push for independence. If not, thanks for joining this segment of Inside the Teen Mind.
If today's episode resonated and you're looking for professional support, Connick & Associates specializes in therapy and comprehensive assessments for teens and families with a strong focus on neurodivergence, adolescent development, and parenting support.
And if your teen who's 5th grade through 12th grade is looking for a place to feel accepted, connected with other peers, and build confidence outside of a traditional setting, the Alive Center offers teen-led, teen-driven programming that supports social connection, leadership, and belonging.
You can learn more about both Connick & Associates and Alive Center through the links in our show notes.
And if this episode was helpful, we'd love for you to subscribe, leave a review, share it, and join us for the next conversation.